Welcome, sleepy traveler. You've arrived at a quiet space made just for you. My name is Valarie, and I am here to guide you gently into rest, to help ease your mind, soften your body, and drift you toward a peaceful, uninterrupted sleep. Whether your day was long or your thoughts feel a little too loud tonight, let this be your permission to slow down, to breathe, and to simply be. There's nothing more to do now. Just allow my voice to be your guide as we begin this gentle journey toward deep, nourishing rest. If you're new here, subscribe for sleep content like this, and like this video if you find it enjoyable. Let's begin. Take in a slow, deep breath and let it out softly, as though the air itself is carrying away the weight of your day. Feel the rise and fall of your chest as your body begins to settle. Inhale gently, letting calmness fill you. Exhale slowly, letting tension drift away. There is nothing you need to do right now. No rush, no responsibilities, only this quiet moment for you. Let your awareness rest fully in the here and now. Notice the surface beneath you supporting your body. It holds you completely, allowing you to release all effort. Feel yourself sinking a little deeper with each breath. As if the earth itself is embracing and holding you in safety. Your spine begins to relax, each vertebra softening into comfort. Your body is giving itself permission to let go. Bring gentle attention to your face. Smooth out your forehead, easing away the day's expressions. Let your eyebrows soften, your eyes heavy and calm. Your cheeks loosen and your jaw releases all tension. Even your tongue rests softly in your mouth, free of effort. Your whole face feels warm, soft, and serene. Take another slow breath and notice your neck and shoulders. They may have been holding the weight of your day. Allow them to drop naturally, melting into the surface below. A gentle heaviness flows down your upper arms, through your elbows and forearms, into your hands and all the way to your fingertips. Every muscle in your arms is now loose and free. Focus on the rhythm of your breathing once more. Each inhale bringing in a wave of calm. Each exhale carrying away the last bits of tension. Your chest rises and falls like a calm ocean tide. Steady, soothing, and effortless. Move your awareness to your belly. Let it soften as you exhale, free of any holding. Feel the gentle expansion and release with every breath. Your lower back sinks more deeply into support. From the top of your shoulders to the base of your spine, everything is loose. Now your hips begin to release. Your thighs soften, heavy and warm. Your knees and calves relax completely. Your ankles, feet, and even your toes are free. Your entire body is now resting in perfect harmony. Picture a soft golden light appearing above your head. It glows like the first rays of morning sunlight, gentle and warm. Slowly, the light begins to drift down, touching the crown of your head. Where it touches, calm spreads through every muscle and every cell. The golden light moves over your forehead and eyes. Down your cheeks and jaw, smoothing away all strain. Your face glows in peace and serenity. The light travels to your neck and shoulders, dissolving tension. Then flows through your arms, hands, and fingertips, leaving warmth and calm in its path. The golden light reaches your chest now. It fills your heart with gentle warmth and safety. Spreads through your lungs and ribs, moving with your breath. Your whole upper body is now glowing with relaxation. The light continues to your belly and lower back, softening and releasing every muscle it touches. It drifts to your hips, your thighs, and your knees. Down to your calves, ankles, and all the way to your toes. Your entire body is surrounded by this golden cocoon of peace. Take a long, slow inhale. And a soft, complete exhale. You are fully relaxed now, held in warmth and safety. In your mind, imagine yourself lying beneath a vast night sky. The air is cool and fresh, carrying the soft scent of night flowers. The ground beneath you is soft and supportive. Above you, stars begin to appear one by one. Each star twinkles like a tiny lantern. The more you gaze, the more the sky fills with sparkling light. A crescent moon rises slowly, bathing the world in silver. Its glow feels like a soft, protective hand resting over you. A gentle night breeze brushes against your skin. Somewhere nearby, a stream trickles softly over smooth stones. Every sound is part of nature's lullaby, calling you to rest. The earth holds you. The sky watches over you. The night wraps around you like a blanket. If a thought drifts into your mind, see it as a soft cloud, floating slowly across the open sky. It moves on its own, leaving the space clear and calm. You do not need to hold or follow anything. You are free to simply rest. Take one more deep, easy breath in and let it go with a soft sigh. Feel the complete weight of your body sinking into rest. Your mind is light, floating in quiet ease. Your body is heavy, grounded, and deeply safe. You are drifting now, held by the night. Floating toward a world of dreams, peaceful and kind. There's nothing left to do. Only to surrender to this soft, healing sleep. Good night. Rest deeply and enjoy tonight's bedtime story. The first thing I yank from the earth isn't a weed. It's a thought I've been too polite to say aloud. I'm tired of being the quiet in everyone else's storm. The thought shocks me with its clarity, the way a snapped violin string goes suddenly, indecently silent. It arrives at the end of a day that smells faintly of stale coffee and sandalwood candles, in my office where the clock's second hand pecks at the wall like a persistent bird. All afternoon I have nodded and made room, stretching my face into soft places so that griefs and angers can land without breaking. 38 isn't old, but it is old enough to know the weight of other people's hours, and I carry a sackful home each evening like groceries I never meant to buy. I turn off the lamp, lock the door, and ride the elevator to the parking garage with my reflection for company. She looks tired in the stainless steel walls, hair twisted into a bun that holds like a vow, mouth chapped from 4 cups of green tea and not enough water. When the doors open, the cool breath of concrete greets me, and I tell myself for the 100th time that I'll take a vacation soon. A real one. A small island where the wind remembers my name. Home sits obediently where I left it. A townhouse with straight lines, a white sofa that resents crumbs, and a kitchen arranged like a diagram. I wash my hands and watch my own fingers under the water, skin blanching, knuckles glistening. There's a lemon next to the sink that I keep for the idea of freshness more than its juice. I cut it anyway, and the blade slides through as if the fruit has been waiting to let go. I eat toast standing up, nibbling the corners down to a neat triangle because sitting feels like a promise I can't keep. The silence here is efficient, like a dishwasher hum on energy saver mode. No music, no television, just the long, unthreading spool of nothing much. By 9, I am in bed with a book I can't inhabit. My eyes move across the lines, but nothing adheres. The clock in the living room ticks through the wall, a polite metronome dictating a life that has fallen into time but not rhythm. When I finally sleep, it's the thin kind, the kind that could be mistaken for deep thought if you catch me in the right light. In the morning, I make coffee and watch the steam rise like something rehearsing ascent. I pull back the curtains and the day falls into the room in square pieces. There, on the patch of front lawn that the HOA insists I pretend to value, dandelions have staged a coup. Overnight they have sprouted small suns, smiling their rude gold faces at the neighborhood. They are not beautiful here. They are a problem. That's how I've been trained to see them. Symptoms, not phenomena. I stare at them with the kind of curiosity that edges into envy. They look unbothered. They look exactly like themselves. I drink half my coffee and step outside in my slippers, forgetting that the concrete will be cold. It is. The air smells like wet soil and last night's rain. And in that moment, for reasons I don't analyze, something in me unbuttons. I do not put on gloves. The grass cups my feet and the dandelions nod, and I kneel on the edge of the lawn with a small private pleasure that feels illicit, like swearing in church. The first weed surrenders with a damp sigh. Cool dirt pushes into the half-moons of my nails. It is gentler than I expected. I find the root where the stem narrows to white and twist, careful, until it releases entirely. A bright little spine with hair-thin veins. It leaves a clean pocket in the soil. I move to the next and then the next. My robe scoops dew at the knees, and my hair slips out of its clip to kiss my cheek. The world narrows to this simple liturgy. Reach, pinch, lift. The scent is astonishing. A green ache, a crushed sweetness that makes the back of my throat shine. Somewhere a car door slams. Somewhere a dog gives its opinion. But here in this small square I am inside a bowl of quiet, and the quiet has a temperature I can finally feel. 20 minutes pass like 5. My knees are damp and my fingers are black, and there's a small pile of yellow-headed bodies beside me like trophies I'm not sure what to do with. A neighbor I don't know walks by with a stroller and glances over. I expect the chorus about property values, curb appeal, turf. Instead, she gives me a smile I recognize from the other side of the couch, the kind that accepts someone else's moment without needing to add sound to it, and keeps going. The wheels of the stroller hiss on the wet sidewalk. The baby raises a socked foot like a little flag. I pull another dandelion, and another thought loosens. What if I could want something that isn't useful to anyone but me? All day I measure my usefulness. Insurance codes, treatment plans, progress notes. I am steady, I am good at it. People say thank you and mean it. Still, there's a thin rattle in my chest sometimes, a teacup on a saucer in the back of a car, tapping to remind me it exists. Kneeling here, I do not think about outcomes or goals. The dirt makes maps of my palms. The sun rolls along the edges of clouds and the warmth lands on my shoulders like an apology. By the time I stand, dizziness washes up and then recedes. I look down at the uneven patch I've cleared, a long belly of earth showing through like a wound that has decided to heal. I don't know what grows here or how anything grows here. I just know something inside me recognized the grip of a root and wanted to give it a clean exit. In the shower, I watch brown braid into the water, and the river at my feet carries everything away without judgment. I scrub under my nails and feel ridiculous for how proud I am of the small bare patch I made. It's nothing. It's a gesture. It's the first sentence of a letter I haven't written yet. At lunch, between sessions, I tell no one about the dandelions. I say the right things about boundaries and rest, about the body's authentic calls, about credible commitments to joy. I say them calmly because they are true, and because I'm speaking to people who are both brave and exhausted. By 4 o'clock, my voice is a little hoarse, and I'm thinking about soil again, the way it opened, the way it let go. When I drive home, the sky is a chalky blue that reminds me of my middle school gym uniform. The grocery store is crowded with families deciding on pastas. A man arguing about cantaloupe ripeness to someone on speakerphone. I buy nothing that makes sense together. A bag of potting soil because I like the smell. A packet of basil seeds because I like the word basil. And a trowel I pick up and put down twice before committing. A woman with purple hair compliments my sensible shoes. "They look like they know where they're going," she says, and I laugh in a way that startles me with its softness. At home, I dump the soil into a ceramic bowl I usually reserve for lemons. The new dirt smells like memory. Summer porches, the hot backs of my knees on Dad's old pickup bench, the way the world used to be just things and not meanings. I sit at the dining table with a mechanical pencil and a pad of graph paper I keep for budgets, and I make an outline that looks like an apology at first, then gradually like a plan. I sketch a little gate where there isn't one. I draw stone paths by copying the general shape of my own fingerprints. I block out a square for herbs, a semicircle for flowers I can't yet name. I am careful not to call any of it a project. I write, "Front garden, just for me," across the top and underline it twice. My handwriting goes sloppy on the words, "just for me," as if my hand doesn't quite believe my permission. I do not know which plants need sun and which need shade. I do not know how many hours of light my yard receives or what the soil wants from me. I do not know what someone would say if they wanted to make me feel foolish. What I do know is that the quiet that fell on me this morning had a shape, and that shape looked a lot like a place to kneel. My body is telling me about a room that doesn't have walls. After dinner, an egg folded into rice with butter and a little salt, because I don't have the patience for anything that requires patience. I go outside with a tape measure and an optimism that makes me feel briefly young. The tape unspools with a metal purr. I mark the corner of the future herb bed with a stone I find near the downspout. I look ridiculous to anyone watching. That is a fact and also a freedom. A breeze comes down the street and with it someone's dinner. Garlic, onions, the char of meat. A dog barks. Children squeal in an improvised game in the cul-de-sac. My mailbox, which I haven't painted since I moved in, leans by a degree that has always annoyed me. Soon, I tell it, the way I tell clients the truth about incremental progress. It is funny, suddenly, and I grin at the mailbox as if we have just conspired to commit a small benevolent crime. When I go back inside, the house feels less sterile, not because I've changed anything, but because some portion of the day was spent moving without trying to fix. I roll the graphite of my plan between my fingers. The eraser leaves a little pink grit like confetti. I set the paper beside the bowl of soil and line up the trowel next to it as if I am laying down my own instruments. The basil seeds, still in their glossy packet, look like passports. The phone rings. It's my mother, which is to say it's a minor test I usually pass. I love her. She loves me. We have learned to love from a measured distance. I was thinking of you, she says, the way she often does, because thinking is our family's sport. What were you thinking? I ask, tracing the outline of the fake gate I drew. That your cousin's boy started a garden, she says. He's very into tomatoes. He sends photos. You know how boys are when they discover that dirt does things. She laughs, and her laugh is my laugh, only practiced longer. I never had patience for it, she adds. I liked the look of a lawn that behaved. Outside the window, the dandelion heads I didn't pull earlier wave their wire-thin necks in the last light. I pulled weeds this morning, I hear myself say. You did? Surprise softens her tone. What got into you? The grass, I say, and we both chuckle, startled by the little joy of it. We do not talk long. We have learned to hand each other small cups of ourselves and then say good night before anything spills. After we hang up, I sit on the floor between the coffee table and the couch and lay the plan on the rug. The graph paper lines look like a little town seen from above. My thumb leaves a faint mark of soil when I brush a crumb away. My mind tries to make the usual lists, costs, steps, supplies, but the quiet I earned in the lawn comes and lays a palm on those lists until they go back to sleep. I think about the people I held today, how Don described his panic as a hallway he couldn't find doors in, how Amelia wanted permission to feel anger like a fever and let it break, how Mrs. Treadwell hid her grief under impeccable lipstick and a story about lilacs. I am grateful for the work. I'm proud of it. But tonight, in the pit I left where a row of dandelions used to be, there is a space inside me that wants something simple, something without a name badge. What if a garden could be that? Not a metaphor, not a harvest measured in jars or bouquets, but a practice of kneeling where the world needs no explanation. Not utility, not productivity, just a small daily attention that no one else requires of me. I pick up the basil packet and turn it over. Full sun, well-drained soil, sow after frost. My mouth tips at the phrase after frost, as if the seed company knows that every instruction, at its heart, is an invitation to patience. My frost has been longer than winter. It has been years of competence that felt like an invisible weight draped across my shoulders like a perfect coat I didn't remember choosing. I take out a pen and write in the margin of the plan. This part is not about being good. This part is about belonging. It looks strange under my hand, like I've borrowed the sentence from someone braver and am trying it on. When the sky deepens to violet, I stand and put on a sweater. I go back outside with a flashlight because I want to see the lawn at night. The beam rakes across the blades, across the little crater pocks where dandelions used to sit like tiny kings. Moths scatter. Somewhere a wind chime tells the dark a secret. I kneel again, just to see if it still feels like mine. The earth is cooler now, but patient. The quiet gathers around me like water around a stone, shaped by the fact of my being here. I think of how often I counsel people about the difference between solitude and isolation. Solitude is chosen, a space where the self can hear itself think. Isolation is a locked room. If you grow too fluent in other people's pain, you can't tell the difference. For years I have called this house my solitude and wondered at the airlessness. But kneeling in the yard with dirt pressed into the cuffs of my jeans, I feel the window unlocked. I do not pray, not exactly, but I do send up a few words like sky lanterns. Let me keep this. Let me build something I don't have to justify. Let it be small, and let it be mine. The next morning I wake with soil still under 2 nails, and the imperfection is a benediction. I make coffee and pour half into a jar to cool for later because I once read coffee is good for compost, and I like the idea of feeding the earth my old wakefulness. I put on a pair of leggings that have known better days, and a shirt I associate with painting, though I haven't painted anything in years. Outside the light is honest, not yet filtered through plans. I measure again. I run a string between 2 sticks and feel ridiculous and alive. The neighbor with the stroller passes again. This time the baby is asleep, and she raises 2 fingers in greeting the way people do at 4-way stops in friendly towns. I raise my muddy hand back, absurdly grateful to belong to this morning. By 9, I have sketched the gentlest path I can manage with my trowel, lifting thin shaving curls of sod and feeling the resistance give. It occurs to me that if someone asked, I would say I'm making a garden, but that's not exactly true. I'm making a place where I can kneel without apology. The things that grow there will be proof I showed up. Around 10, the mail carrier, Mr. Ruiz, who remembers every dog in the neighborhood by name and every human by preference for signatures, stops at my box. He taps it lightly with his knuckles. "You're doing something," he says, and it is not a question. "I'm trying," I answer. The words feel like they refer to everything and also to this small curve of earth. He grins. That's how it starts. He points at the dandelions in my pile. "Those have more life in them than you'd think. They'll be back just to see if you meant it." "I mean it," I say, out loud, to the weeds, to the morning, to myself. When I finally go inside to wash up, I leave the door cracked. The house breathes differently when it can smell the world. I sit at the dining table and slide my plan toward me, and the pencil finds the margin again. A small front garden, I write. Not for beauty, not for productivity, for me. The periods are little pebbles laid on a path so the sentence doesn't blow away. I allow myself a little flourish. I draw an arch of morning glories over the imaginary gate, entirely too ambitious for someone who had to Google what well-drained soil meant, and I do it anyway because desire requires practice. The sketch is childish, imperfect, mine. I place it under a magnet on the fridge like a report card no one has to grade. At lunch, I sit on the front steps with my bowl and watch the way the neighborhood holds itself. A teenage boy rides by with headphones, mouthing an epic no one else can hear. The man 3 houses down sweeps the same 4 feet of sidewalk with ritualistic precision. A cat with one ear folded makes its rounds, pretending not to know me. The sun lingers on my kneecaps, and for the first time in a long time, I feel the day not as something coming at me, but as something I am quietly inside of. I think of my clients, of the particular ache of being alive, of how stubborn hope is, how it keeps pushing up between cracks in driveways, even when everyone tells it not to embarrass itself. The dandelions have taught me, in their impolite abundance, that most things we call weeds are just plants that have memorized persistence. I want to memorize it too, without apologizing for the bright yellow of my want. In the late afternoon, when the light thins to a careful gold, I go back out with a watering can I found under the laundry sink, inherited from the previous owner along with the mailbox's lien. I pour slowly into the line I've carved and watch the water darken the soil. The smell rises again, green, loamy, a note of iron, and I swear my body takes the scent like a vitamin. Everything in me that's been hunched forward to hear other people better eases back an inch. The quiet is not complete. It doesn't need to be. It's the kind you can carry inside, like a pocket smooth with use. Night comes. I sit cross-legged on the rug and assemble a stack of seed catalogs I've requested, laughing at myself for ordering them before I know what I'm doing. Their pages are glossy realism and impossible promise. Black-eyed Susans that grin like cousins at a picnic. Lavender that promises sleep I haven't earned. I circle with a pen. I argue with myself about space and sunlight and money. And yet beneath the argument there is a river of certainty. Every circle is a way of saying yes. Before bed, I step out one last time. The stars have pricked their small holes in the dark. The street is a hush punctuated by sprinkler sputter and far-off laughter. I kneel, not to work, but simply to acknowledge. My palms rest on the ground, and I feel the day settle into the earth, the way flour settles in a sifter. I am the quiet in other people's storms. I am grateful to be. But here in this unfinished curve, I am something else too. I am someone who knelt, who pulled a root until it gave, who let her hands learn a new language. Tomorrow I will return to my office and the clock will peck again, and I will hold the stories I've promised to hold. But tomorrow evening and the evening after I will come back to this small front, to the dandelions who refuse to apologize, to the soil that does not ask for eloquence. Upstairs, I wash my hands and leave one smudge of dirt on the edge of the sink on purpose. It will be there in the morning, proof that I didn't dream the whole thing. I turn off the light and slide into bed, and the silence that comes is not the sterile kind. It is the kind that a field makes when the wind lies down, the kind a garden makes before it has learned to use its voice. It is a living quiet, which is to say, it is mine. Sometime after midnight, I wake to the need to write. I pad to the kitchen and put my plan on the table and add one more line under the underlined words. A small front garden, not for beauty or productivity, but simply for myself. A place to kneel and become unhelpful in all the necessary ways. I place the pencil down. The house hums its low, contented hum. Outside in the dark, a root keeps pretending toward the surface. I think I can hear it if I try, if I stop trying. I close my eyes and the quiet leans in. Tomorrow I will begin. I suppose I already have. I didn't mean to pray, but when the first seedling slid out of its crinkled plastic sleeve and rested in my palm like a small beating secret, something inside me said yes with a reverence that sounded suspiciously like amen. I'd promised myself not to overthink it. No charts, no garden blogs at 2 a.m., no cross-referencing pH balances or frost dates until the joy drained away and left Data standing in a neat suit. So I drove to the nursery that wears a crown of wind chimes and neon geraniums every spring, and bought what felt like sentences of a language I could speak without grammar. Lavender for breath, marigolds for brightness, basil because the word itself is soft on the tongue, a modest haul, a beginner's humility in a cardboard tray. I parked in my driveway and carried them to the front patch like a procession of good news. The marigolds had faces, round and unapologetic, like cheerful aunties who clap at the end of your story whether or not it had an ending. The lavender was taller than I expected and already trying to perfume the entire street through a sheen of silver green. The basil leaves were small, tender ears listening for summer. I set them in a row and sat on the steps, paper cup of coffee cooling in my hand, letting the sight of new life trick me into a quieter pulse. My yard had slept under my inattention for years. Now it felt awake, as if it had been quietly shifting its weight, waiting for me to say, "I'm ready to learn your name." The soil I'd loosened the previous evening, my fresh, imperfect half-moon, looked like an invitation. I knelt, this time with a thin cushion I found in the hall closet and a small trowel that had already started to wear a nick where it met stone. I pressed my thumb into the dirt, and the dirt received it the way a friend's hand does when you don't have words yet. Lavender first. The tag said "Full Sun," and the side of the house closest to the mailbox drank light from late morning to dinner. I made a pocket and settled the lavender into it, easing the roots apart with the kind of care I offer in my office when someone is ready to say what they've been circling for months. "There you go," I said out loud, and laughed at myself. Talking to a plant felt less ridiculous than some of the lies I've told my own nervous system about what is and is not allowed to soothe. Marigolds next, 3 of them, a small choir. I spaced them farther than seemed necessary. Space is a luxury I've always underfunded. The basil went into the warmest-looking spot like a guest who needs a good seat and a simple first question. I watered each hole before the plant, like a benediction, then tucked the soil back around their ankles and pressed gently. There is a right pressure, just enough to say, "I'm here with you," not so much that roots can't breathe. I found it by instinct, and then lost it, and then found it again. I was clumsy. I was happy. A breeze lifted the hem of my t-shirt. Somewhere farther down the block, a radio offered a 90s song that once meant nothing and now means everything. The basil leaves brightened in the light as if someone had whispered good news directly to their veins. I watched water sink, watched soil darken and then loosen its black shine back into matte. The quiet gathered around me like a shawl I hadn't noticed was hanging on the chair. The world is full of declarations about starting small. I've said them, written them on sticky notes for clients to find on bathroom mirrors in the morning. But there is a difference between talking about starting small and kneeling to place your hands into a small beginning. The difference is warmth. It is temperature and weight and the particular gravity of doing. All morning that gravity held me in place without the fatigue that so often follows. I wasn't spent by the end. I was somehow more available to my own breath. I had an afternoon appointment block, 3 sessions back to back, that I'd considered moving. Instead, I left them on the schedule but padded the hour before with a decision. I would work outside until the last possible minute, go wash up, and then meet my clients with the dirt still under my nails if it wanted to stay. I slipped into the rhythm you discover when the living thing in front of you teaches you the exact speed it needs. Swifter than fear, slower than anxiety. Halfway through pinching the little basil tips, a video I'd once half-watched had told me to do that, and my hands seemed to remember. I heard footsteps on the sidewalk and looked up. Emma. She saw me the way people see someone out of context and blink twice. She usually arrives 10 minutes early, sits in her car, breathes her way through the last song on the radio, then comes up. Today she was early and walking, hair tucked into a messy bun that meant she'd been at her computer until it was time to stop, then had to choose movement or melt. She had the posture of a person ready to make it through something. not to be surprised by anything. Then she smiled, not the practiced smile she gives me at the beginning of sessions to say, "We're safe, right?" But the looser one that escaped during week 6 when she described her grandmother's cinnamon toast. "I didn't know you were a gardener," she said, hands on hips in the universal human stance of admiration mixed with bewilderment. "I didn't either," I said, and we both laughed. I felt my shoulders drop another half-inch. She stopped at the little curve of dirt and looked down. "They're so green," she said, then shook her head at herself. "That's dumb, but it's like they're very here." "That's not dumb," I said. "That's accurate." I reached for the watering can and, without thinking too much about boundaries or appropriate scripts, heard myself ask, "Do you want to help me water before we go in?" Her eyebrows lifted. A small ripple of caution moved through me. The manual inside me, dog-eared and highlighted over years, whispering about roles, about setting, about care and shared spaces. But it wasn't only caution. It was also an exhale. We had 60 minutes and a story that had been hard to meet with language lately. Maybe the garden could hold part of it. She glanced at the house, at her watch, at the basil as if it had made a good argument. "Yes," she said, and the word sounded like a stretch in her throat, a yawn after too much news. I handed her the can. "Just around the base," I suggested, "like you're telling the roots you're here." She crouched, knees cracking softly. The water arced in a small glitter and then disappeared into the soil, leaving the basil shining darker, brighter. "It's like pouring a drink for someone who doesn't have a mouth," she said, and then flushed. "Sorry, I haven't had enough coffee." "It's perfect," I said. "I think they hear with their feet." We tended without talking for a minute. I showed her the marigold's little ruffled edges and the lavender's woody ankle and where I'd loosened the soil so air could find its way in. She reached out and touched the lavender like she was afraid it might break, then brought her fingers to her nose and inhaled. When she looked up, her eyes were different. Less glassy, less backlit by the blue of her laptop. "It doesn't take words," she said, almost to herself. "It doesn't," I echoed. We stood. I set the can down, water sloshing in the belly. A neighbor across the street hoisted a bike onto a porch hook. A delivery truck exhaled at the corner. I felt the usual therapist voice in me begin its warming up, questions sorting themselves, threads of last session ready to be picked back up. But another voice, quieter and older, said, "Wait, let this be the start." "Do you want to sit for 5 minutes?" I asked. "Here, just here." I gestured to the front steps. "We can count it as the first 5 minutes of our hour." She nodded and we sat, not facing each other, facing the garden, The lavender threw its little columns of scent into the sunny air like an offering. A bee paused over the marigolds, took inventory, moved on. I felt, in the slow hush that pooled between us, the way grief sometimes uncurls when it thinks no one is watching, not with a sob, with a long animal breath. I did not say my usual opening line, neither did she. We just let the minutes be what they were, minutes. Afterward, we went inside and found language more gently than we had the week before. It didn't feel like a miracle. It felt like someone had taken the cap off a pen that had been chewing through it from the inside, and the ink could finally make its way to paper. The session wound along its river. We named a few rocks. We did not move them. I wrote a single sentence in my notes afterward and let it be enough. Started on the steps. I closed my notebook and went back outside before my next call, mostly to look at the basil and thank it for being so unabashedly basil. By the time the sun tipped west, the plants had shifted infinitesimally, as if they'd leaned toward their own best possibilities. I watered again, gently, so as not to erode the new beds. I talked to them without shame. "I know," I said. "It's a lot to ask, to root in a place that didn't even know it wanted you last week." That evening, I slid my shoes off at the door and left a small constellation of soil on the mat. I warmed pasta with butter and more butter and sat on the floor, back against the couch, bowl in lap, watching a tutorial on deadheading marigolds that was 8 minutes too long and exactly the company I wanted. When my phone buzzed, I ignored it, then felt something like a nudge and checked anyway. Emma had emailed. Subject line, "Today." I opened it. The message was short, a little raw at the edges, the way writing looks when it's sent before it gets dressed up. "Hi, Madison. I just wanted to say that kneeling in the dirt with you this afternoon was the first time I felt quiet in weeks. I didn't know my head had a volume knob until then. I don't know if this is therapeutic in quotes, but it felt true. See you next week. Also, your marigolds are ridiculously cheerful. I might buy some. E." I read it twice, and then again. I'm seasoned enough at this work to recognize when something moves under the usual surface. The email was a small golden fish flashing near the top. I closed my eyes and saw the arc of water leaving the can, the way it hung for a second before it disappeared into the ground. I felt my own breath make a soft, surprised shape. The garden had offered a sentence my office couldn't write. I thought of ethics, of consistency, of the ways a space holds the story we tell within it. And also I thought of kneeling, of how the body knows before the mind gives permission. Maybe it wasn't about replacing the room with the yard, but about remembering that what heals doesn't always speak fluent English. Some languages are older, some are wetter, some grow. I wrote back, "I'm so glad the minutes outside felt quiet for you. There's room for that kind of quiet in our work. See you next week." P.S. If you do buy marigolds, pick the ones that look like they laugh at bad jokes. Then I put the phone down and didn't pick it up again for an hour. I made tea and took it outside and sat on the steps in the kind of dusk that braids purple into everything. My seedlings were small silhouettes. The basil had an almost heat to it that felt like a promise of July. A moth discovered me and then decided I was too big to manage. I stuck my pinky in the soil to check it and came away damp to the second knuckle. Good. Enough. Rest. Behind me, the house felt less like a museum of good habits and more like a home someone had started living in recently. I let that idea lean against me like a content cat. The wind moved through the new leaves and made a sound smaller than rain. A car door thunked. Someone laughed, then laughed again. I slept that night without the frantic mental scrolling of shoulds. When I woke, my first thought was of water, not the unending kind from 1,000 tabs of news, but the simple kind that flows from a spout into a can, into earth, into roots, into leaf, into air, into breath. A loop I could put my hands in. I poured coffee, saved half in a jar for the compost I did not yet have, and stepped outside with my robe belted tight and my hair in the kind of ponytail that admits defeat and calls it style. Mourning with plants is different than mourning with people. People want to know the plan. Plants want to know the light. I checked the lavender. It had a grace even in stillness, an architectural poise that made me feel underdressed in a way I liked. The marigolds were bright even with dew clinging to their lashes. The basil had unfurled one more tiny leaf in the night, like a promise kept without fanfare. I watered. The can had learned my wrist, and my wrist had learned the tilt. I hummed something tuneless. The sun warmed the top of my head and the bridge of my nose. I felt the little thing that had started inside me yesterday spread into the space between my ribs like a tent being raised. Air finding a volume it had been denied. I wasn't less me in this, I was more. At lunch, between 2 telehealth sessions and a note I had been avoiding because its edges worried me, I stood in the doorway and stared at the yard like it was a friend waiting in a coffee shop window. It was ridiculous how happy the sight made me. New life says so many ordinary things with such conviction. I will reach, I will drink, I will make more of myself with what you offer me and the sun offers me and what I find on my own. I let it say them to me because I needed to hear them in a voice that wasn't mine. After work, I went to the nursery again, not to add, but to learn. I asked the woman at the counter about spacing lavender and the thing where marigolds get leggy and whether basil forgives. She talked with her hands and her whole face, a kindness that reminded me of the best part of my own job, sharing what you love without making it feel like homework. I bought nothing. I left with a handful of free advice in the pocket of my jacket like seed I might spill by accident and be grateful later when something grew where I'd been careless. On the way home, I passed Emma on the sidewalk. She had a paper bag from the same nursery, a grin I hadn't seen before. We slowed. We did not stop. We lifted our bags like a secret handshake. Boundaries can include joy. Joy can include the small levity of two people who met in one language finding out they share another. That evening, I deadheaded the marigolds because the video had convinced me to be ruthless with what was finished. The act was strangely satisfying. This is no longer serving. Snip, thank you, goodbye. I carried the spent heads to the compost bucket I'd improvised from an old mixing bowl and felt, absurdly, like the past could be fuel if I was neat about it. Later, when the sky turned the color of lavender I couldn't yet grow in profusion, I took my notebook outside. I wrote sentences that surprised me by how much they sounded like the ones I say in my office. Start where your hands already know the way. Give the roots water, not the leaves. Make space around what you want to grow. Cut back what is done so that what isn't can have room. I didn't intend to write aphorisms, but they landed on the page like small birds, and I didn't shoo them away. The email from Emma had opened something larger than the note itself. It wasn't just that she'd felt quiet. It was that the quiet had been accessible through kneeling rather than speaking. I thought of other clients, of Don with his hallways, Amelia with her fever, Mrs. Treadwell with her lipstick and lilacs. I thought of inviting them to the steps for 5 minutes at the start, or at the end, or not inviting them at all, but offering the option like a glass of water left within reach. If your throat is dry, you may drink. If your mind is loud, you may kneel. No pressure, just a place. I heard the stern inner voice. Are you sure? Is this the work? I heard another softer voice say, it is adjacent. It is adjacent enough. The work is to help people find themselves where they can actually meet themselves. Sometimes that meeting requires language. Sometimes it requires loam. I sat with the tension because that's what I teach, and because it felt less like a dilemma and more like a root testing the soil's edge. The steps would not become the couch. The basil would not become the DSM, but the garden had become, in a day, a kind of porch between worlds, and I could see how standing there might help some people come inside. A cardinal lit on the mailbox and scolded me for thinking too loudly. I laughed. I put the notebook down. I watered again, even though the soil was still soft, just to watch the dark spread and the leaves let the droplets gather at their tips like jewelry. When the streetlights came on, one by one, and my small plot turned into an island in the manufactured dusk, I said goodnight to each plant as if I were tucking in small children with different bedtimes. The lavender got a hand on the very top. The marigolds, a ruffle of their pom-poms. The basil, a whispered promise that I would not take too much, too soon. Inside, I wiped my hands and checked my email again. Another message from Emma, a link to an article about horticulture therapy with a parenthetical. Not trying to prescribe your job to you, just thought it was interesting. Either way, I'm buying a trowel. I clicked the link, skimmed enough to register the shape of something both ancient and newly named, then closed the tab. I didn't want jargon to co-opt what we discovered at the steps. Not yet. For now, the language of our practice would remain simple. Water, kneel, quiet. Before bed, I stood at the window and looked out at the shadow shapes of my small beginnings. I could feel, even from here, the steady work happening underground, the roots adjusting, tasting, unfurling, making decisions the sky couldn't witness. I felt my chest mirror the movement, small shifts specific to my unseen network. I placed a palm against the glass and felt the cool, then the warmth of my own skin press back. The first shift had found us almost as an accident, a passing by, an invitation, an email. But maybe that's how change wants to come. Not as a lecture with slides, but as a seedling in a paper cup you didn't know you were ready to hold. I had set some small life in the ground that morning without overthinking, and the sight of it had fed me in a way my carefully arranged, silent evenings never quite had. Emma had knelt, watered, breathed, and felt quiet return like a tide that had simply been waiting for the moon to remember what to do. I turned off the light and slipped into bed. The house's night noises went on cataloging themselves, the refrigerator's low theology, the clock's patient peck, the neighbor's late laugh. I closed my eyes and thought, not of tomorrow's sessions or next weekend's chores, but of a small green leaf and the way it catches morning. I gave the thought a place to root, then let it be. Somewhere between waking and sleep, I felt the shape of the garden in me, curved, modest, alive. I saw hands, mine, Emma's, lowering the can, water arcing in a glitter, earth darkening and opening to receive. I felt the simple miracle of attention, unburdened by outcome, and I knew, with a certainty I didn't need to sharpen into a plan, that I would keep kneeling. I would keep watering. I would let the steps be a threshold. I would let the marigolds laugh. I would let the basil teach me to pinch and not apologize. The last thought before the soft drop into sleep came like a root breaking into a new chamber of soil. Maybe the garden and I will grow each other. Maybe that is all the language we need. I didn't set out to build a chapel with dirt for stained glass, but that's what the garden became. The first place I've seen prayers answered without anyone needing to say them out loud. In the morning light, lavender leans as if it knows a secret about the day. The marigolds have multiplied into bright, laughing suns. The basil has grown thick enough that when I brush it, the air sweetens in self-defense. The path I carved like a shy comma is now a sentence others know how to finish. It started with Emma, then widened the way a river does when a bank gives gently. People began to pause, not because I asked them to, not because of any sign, but because a little square of earth was doing a thing we recognize without language. It was telling the body, "You can be here." Word did not so much spread as drift. It arrived in the neighborhood like scent, like a rumor the wind carries about a place where tired people remember how to let their shoulders drop. A woman with a stroller told a man with a dog, told a teenager with a pencil, told herself. My clients must have said something small to themselves on Tuesday evenings that made them walk the extra 20 steps from car to steps, then linger. There was no open sign. There was no closing bell. The only rule I made and never spoke was this: nothing is owed here except attention, and even that can be partial. The widower came first. He stood at the edge of the lawn in a pressed button-down, the color of rainwater, with a small rose bush in a pot hugged close to his chest, as if it might hear something his sternum still said at night. I knew him from 2 doors down, a quiet man whose porch light comes on at the exact right time and goes off as if with ceremony. He had never waved exactly, but we had nodded in winter over recycling bins, which in my neighborhood constitutes intimacy. He cleared his throat. "I heard," he said, then stopped, a little embarrassed at the vagueness. His eyes landed on the marigolds, then the lavender, then found a resting place on the patch of sun between them. "I was wondering if I might plant this," he said, "if that's all right." The plant was small but stubborn-looking, like someone who doesn't know how not to bloom even when it's inconvenient. The tag said Eden Rose in cursive that looked like it didn't quite trust the paper. "It's more than all right," I said. I pointed to a spot along the path where the soil stayed warm even when the day cooled. "There?" He nodded. "She liked roses," he offered, the word "liked" sounding like a long hallway his voice had to travel down to reach us. "Not in the fussy way. The smell of them on a porch." He set the pot down and knelt in jeans that still had the faint fold lines from a drawer. He dug in with his hands before I could offer a trowel, as if he needed skin on earth or nothing at all. The dirt yielded. Dirt is generous as a rule. We worked in a wordless agreement. He digging, me holding the stem steady, both of us pretending not to hear how the world quieted to let this happen. When we'd set the rose in its hollow and tucked the soil back like a blanket, he sat back on his heels and pressed his muddy fingers together as if in a prayer he didn't intend. "Magda," he said, not to me, to the rose, to the air. The name stood up in the afternoon and became a person. He smiled. Not the smile of a life without grief, but the kind you make when you find a photograph you thought you'd lost. A smile with rain in it. He looked at me carefully. "Would you mind if I came by?" he managed. To check on her? Please, I said. Every day, if you like. He nodded, stood, brushed his hands on his knees, then, as if granting permission to the day to continue, told me he had extra mulch if I needed it. The good kind, which sounded like a secret handshake. When he left, the rose stood newly at home, a small bravery with thorns. I watered it the way you water grief, enough to show up, not enough to drown. The next week, a teacher stopped on a Wednesday with the posture of someone whose body has memorized bells. She was in a skirt that had made friends with wrinkles and carrying a tote bag that sighed when she set it down. I'd seen her pass before. She lives around the corner, where chalk dust probably follows her like a comet tail. She reached for an empty spot near the basil and crouched, fingers quick, practical. "Do you mind if she began, already pulling a weed by its collar the way you pluck a crayon out of a chaotic bin. "Go ahead," I said, and pointed her to the small pile I used to make a mountain of the day's small unnecessaries. She smiled, wry and grateful, and set to work. The weeds gave with a sound like a zipper. She talked while she worked, the way people talk while folding laundry. Honest because the hands are busy. "I have 28 this year," she said. 28 separate weather systems in one room. Someone cried because a paper towel tore wrong, and someone else solved a math problem with a drawing of a dinosaur eating a triangle, and I wanted to weep with relief. The administration wants fidelity to curriculum, and the kids want reasons to be human, and my throat hurts from choosing which to defend every hour. She held up a fat clump of plant I'd never learned the name of, but had developed a personal antagonism toward. We admired its root system, impressive as a decision that looks small and then changes everything. "I dream of silence," she confessed, laughed. "Then when I get it, I worry it's because someone's doing something with glue." "Silence is loud when you've earned it," I said, then stopped, noticing how little I needed to add for her to keep going. I used to think my job was a mixture of precision and magic. Lately it felt more like good weather at the right time. She told me about a girl who stayed after class to ask if sadness is an allergy or a disease. About a boy who carries a small rock in his pocket and kisses it before spelling tests. About the way parents write emails at 1 a.m. as if midnight turns worry into law. All the while she pulled and I held the bucket, and the garden did what gardens do. It welcomed the doubled attention of hands and mind, and fed both. She left with dirt on the back of her calf and a calmer mouth. At the sidewalk she turned and raised a hand. "I'll bring my own gloves next time," she called. "I think your weeds like me." "Come without them," I said. "They like us anyway." A few afternoons later I found a drawing propped against my porch. No note, big white paper, the edges weighted by 2 little stones. The garden looked better on the page than reality had allowed for. taller, wider, braver. The lavender skirts were scribbled in a quick musical hand, and the marigolds had been given expressions as if they were in on a joke I only suspected. The basil was a proper jungle, and the path had been shaded in a way that made it feel like a path to somewhere and not just through. In the lower corner, tiny initials, LR. I recognized them a day later, attached to a person. A teenager in a hoodie that said athletics but whose body spoke art drifted by, head down, pencil tucked behind one ear like a small flag. She paused, toeing the edge of the path. "It was you?" I asked, holding the drawing like a treasure that might take offense if praised too loudly. She shrugged the shoulder that meant yes, and also please do not make a big deal of this, or I will have to evaporate. "I come by to look when I can't do the thing," she said. "What thing?" I asked, keeping my voice as casual as a porch swing. "The whole existing in my life thing," she said, mapping a circle in the air with a finger, then pulling a weed with the same hand, decisive. "It's quieter here." "Good quiet?" I asked. "Yeah," she said. "Like Netflix asks if I'm still watching and I get to say no." "That's the best kind," I said. "Thank you for the drawing. It made the garden see itself." She pretended not to glow and then actually glowed. I watched her eyes move across the plants the way a person reads a room looking for doors. She nodded to herself as if the garden had answered a question she had not needed to ask. Then she walked on, leaving the air a little lighter in her wake, the sort of proof teenagers don't know they carry. People kept coming, not in a parade, not with fanfare, just a trickle that never dried up. Sometimes I would look up from pinching basil and find a neighbor standing with both hands in their pockets, waiting to be invited into their own quiet. Sometimes I would open the front door to find a bouquet of volunteer zinnias from someone else's yard, a handful of wild mint, a scribbled note. "Thank you for the smell of summer on bad days." More than once I found a book left on the steps. Dog-eared poetry, a cookbook with a smear of batter on the biscotti page, like offerings to a small green altar. My clients began to arrive 5 minutes early on purpose, not to talk, to kneel. We turned the first moments of many hours into a practice of touch. Fingers in soil, palms pressed to the warm brick of the step. A leaf stroked until its scent let the breath open from the bottom. There were days we did the whole session outside, on the steps, watching the sun inch the shadow along the path. There were days we went in when the garbage truck's noise bullied its way down the street. I found myself watching people watch the plants, the way their faces softened at the edges like old film finally in focus. I spoke less. This was not a vow so much as an effect. The garden took up some of the responsibility my words had always shouldered, and did the lifting with a patience I envied. There were silences that lasted whole minutes, and nobody drowned. The air, held by lavender and basil and marigold and a rose that increasingly insisted on being noticed, self-regulated. I'd always believed in the nervous system's ability to settle when it met safety. Now I watched a patch of earth be the safety, and it undid me in the gentlest way. I noticed, too, how my listening changed. It got roots. Instead of rehearsing responses or cataloging interventions, I listened like soil listens, taking in, holding, letting the water decide its path. When someone's words came out tangled, I learned not to rush at them with a comb. The marigolds taught me to let the spent bloom fall and turn back into ground, to trust that something feeds on what looks finished. The basil taught me to pinch early and often, say no to a thing now so it can say yes more fiercely later. The lavender reminded me the body knows where to lean for light if you don't keep dragging it to the shade of your ideas. The widower, his name is Peter, I learned when a package arrived incorrectly and I took it to his porch, came every morning with a small cup of coffee and sat on the lowest step. He didn't speak at first. After a week, he told me the story of Magda's roses, how she used to crush a petal between finger and thumb and press it behind her ears. Not for perfume, he said, but so the day would know where to find her. He told me about the way her absence had moved in and started rearranging his furniture without permission. He told me a joke she loved badly, then told it again, better, until the punchline lifted between us and hovered for a second like a butterfly that hadn't decided where to land. The rosebush grew 3 new leaves in 2 days, the kind of miracle plants wholesale, and on the 11th morning a bud appeared, round as a throat clearing. He touched it with one finger and then withdrew, as if the shy sacred might be offended by too much reverence. The teacher made the garden a ritual. She'd arrive with a handful of paper clips and a question about whether control is ever kindness, then kneel until her knees had the permanent imprints of this place, and talk while she loosened the tightness around a plant's roots. Once, she cried, not the loud organ-emptying cry of catastrophe, but the thin, efficient weeping of a person who doesn't want anyone to have to clean up after it. She cried onto the soil. It drank and said nothing unhelpful. She wiped her face with the back of a hand and kept working. I think I forget how my hands are old, she laughed, and I knew what she meant. They remember how to save you when your mind is busy building ladders to nowhere. The teenager, L.R., who eventually told me her name was Lyra, like the constellation, which is only cool if you're into space or violins, she said, grinning, came at unpredictable hours and left drawings that made my garden look like a chorus line, all legs and lift. Once she sat on the steps with me as the sky went the bruised color that always unsettles me, and talked about the way silence is different in the places you choose it. She drew a rose that looked like a maze that still somehow lets you out. When I told her the basil felt like a small theater company rehearsing lines for a show called Summer, she didn't look at me like I was ridiculous. She drew a curtain call and handed it to me like a program. There were others. A nurse who left a scrap of ribbon tied to the lavender after a night shift and took nothing but a breath home. A grandfather who taught me to sprinkle crushed eggshells because his mother had. And every garden is a story told in accents you inherit without knowing it. A child who refused to speak to anyone but sang to the marigolds and made them, I swear it, stand a little taller. A mail carrier who delivered a packet of wildflower seeds with my name and a note that said, "For your unruly friends." I put a small bench beneath the window, unpainted, because paint felt like too much instruction. People used it or didn't. Sometimes on Saturdays, the garden took on the murmuring sound of a cafe where no one needs Wi-Fi. Low, companionable, a music you don't notice until it stops. Other times, it was still enough to hear ants negotiating with a crumb. The clock inside my house continued its honest tick. Out here, the only time that mattered was the one flowers know. Inside me, something went analog. My edges softened. My pace learned the speed of a watering can, which is to say the pace of attention that doesn't need proof of its own usefulness to continue. I began to sleep in sheets that smelled faintly of sun. When I spoke in sessions, the sentences were fewer and landed with more weight, the way a well-placed stone gives a river a song. I found that when someone told me they felt like a failure, my body no longer jumped to contradictions. Instead, I wanted to know what soil that feeling grew in, what weather it had survived, how we might loosen what was compacted and see what else wanted a chance. The garden taught me to do less than I thought love required. I expected at some point that someone would complain about the gathering, about the unorthodox beginnings of therapy hours, about the way a front yard had decided to be more than decoration. But the HOA, usually awake to the slightest deviation from the gospel of curb appeal, stayed quiet, perhaps charmed or confused or both. Once the president slowed as he drove past, gave a long look, then gave me a thumbs up like a parent trying out a new language with their kid. I wanted to hand him a marigold and say, "You're allowed to be this bright, too." As the weeks passed, the garden bloomed in the obvious ways, the lavender making cones that bees fell deeply in love with, the marigolds turning into small firework finales, the basil threatening to go to seed just to dare me to keep up. The rose, Magda's rose, our rose, offered its first full blossom on a day when the widower arrived in a suit. He had an appointment with a lawyer, he said, and needed to feel like someone had his back. The rose obliged, opening with a grace that made me want to curtsy. We stood at its edge and breathed until even the street seemed to hold its breath. He touched the petal and smiled a smile I will think of when people tell me time heals. I will remember that time does nothing without a place to land. But the blooming that undid me most was the slower humankind, the gait of someone leaving lighter than they came, the way neighbors who used to stare at their shoes started making eye contact, microsecond longer each week. A teenage boy delivered flyers for a yard sale and left with a stray basil sprout in a paper cup. 2 weeks later, he brought back a photograph of spaghetti he'd made with his mother, both of them grinning as if they'd invented dinner. The teacher brought 3 tiny seedlings her students had coaxed from seeds in cups by the classroom window. One lived. We named it Persevere and pretended we weren't proud. Peter began carrying a second cup of coffee, which he set beside the rose without explanation. Some mornings he spoke to the rose in Polish, and the rose answered in scent. We had no rules, no sign-up sheet, no official hours. Still, the place behaved as if it had been consecrated by the regular practice of people arriving as they were and finding themselves acceptable. There were days when I worried about the edges, ethics, boundaries, the membrane between professional and neighborly, the way compassion can spill and then fray. When those worries came, I didn't dismiss them. I sat with them on the bench and let them watch bees. I asked questions. Is this serving? Is anyone being harmed? Am I hiding in the garden to avoid what needs words? The answers weren't always immediate, but they were honest. If I felt the slope get slippery, I stepped back into the living room with its reliable clock and practiced the craft I trained for. The garden remained a threshold, a vestibule between inside and outside, speech and green. On the first night the fireflies appeared, small lanterns with no agenda. I noticed how much my voice had changed, not pitch or timbre, intention. I said less and meant more. I asked, "Where does it hurt?" and then didn't immediately hand someone my idea of medicine. I let the hurt point. I allowed the basil to be an argument for patience. I watched the marigolds demonstrate how a bright face toward the sun is not denial, but survival. I let the rose teach me to live at the speed of a bud. The teenager's drawings grew bolder. One day she left a sketch of 3 figures on the bench. A man whose grief sits on his shoulder like a patient bird. A woman with a pencil in her hair and dirt on her knees. A person whose face you can't see because they're leaning down, watering. The garden around them looks like music. Underneath, in tiny letters, she wrote, "Not a cure, a place." I taped it to my refrigerator with a magnet shaped like a tomato, and felt my chest do the thing the basil does when the sun hits it just right. Open quietly, like it's its job. I have been a therapist long enough to know that the work is not a fix-it shop. It's a place where the human tangle can be held without being hurried. The garden widened that place in me. It made room for nonverbal yeses. It let me keep my hands busy when my brain wanted to overfunction. It gave people a way to be present without being watched, together without being performed for. It turned my front yard into a commons where no one had to pay with an explanation. One evening I found a note tucked into the lavender, folded into a clean triangle the way you fold a paper you plan to respect. It said in an unsure hand, "I didn't think there was a place to be quiet and not be lonely. I was wrong. Thank you. No name." I set the triangle on the step like a small sailboat and let the wind decide. By late summer, the garden had learned to make itself known in my sleep. I dreamed in greens. I woke with soil under the nail I missed and felt like I'd been granted communion. I started leaving the front light on, not bright, just enough to make the basil glisten like a promise. Sometimes I would sit there after midnight with tea cooling, listening to the neighborhood's night sounds. The fox that sounds like a baby laughing, the distant, world-weary train, the sprinkler's measured applause, and think, this is what a haven is. Not walls that keep out, but a middle space that lets in without swallowing. I don't know when the shift completed, if shifts ever do. Maybe we are always mid-bloom. But there was a morning, a Tuesday with nothing dramatic about it, when I realized I hadn't consulted my inner narrator for a while. The sentences that used to line up to be wise had stopped crowding. I stood with the hose aimed low, and the water darkened the soil in a shape like a question mark, and I felt an answer arrive not in words but in weight. You are allowed to let the garden do some of the comforting. You are allowed to rest in the system that is bigger than your role. You are allowed to trust that quiet is not absence, but a form of holding. I turned off the spigot and listened. Cars, birds, a neighbor calling a name into the morning, a bee negotiating with lavender, the small private sound of roots going about their ancient business. The rose breathed, the marigolds agreed with themselves. The basil made another inch of green argument. And I, Madison, 38, tired and tender and trained and learning again, stood in the chapel I had not intended to build and let it bless me back. The wind took our quiet in one long breath, blew it sideways, lifted it by the roots, and set it down in a language I didn't yet understand. It started like so many summer tantrums do, heat clinging to the afternoon as if it had a right to stay, the sky going from blue to bruised with almost theatrical haste, thunder clearing its throat in the distance like a neighbor about to complain. I checked the forecast and told myself we'd be fine. Lavender's sturdy, marigolds are scrappy, basil forgives. I'd learned to trust the garden's resilience the way you trust an old friend's ability to text home at the end of a rough night. But when the first gust knocked the wind chimes into a frantic confession, my chest tightened. I stepped out onto the porch and watched a darkness fall that didn't belong to 4 p.m. The air went green, the kind of green that makes birds forget the words to their own songs. Leaves turned their pale bellies up. The trees at the end of the street became dancers with bad partners, tugged and shoved and spun against their will. The storm raced down the block like a rumor too juicy to be true. I grabbed what I could, the little bench, the trowel, the empty clay pots that would otherwise turn into missiles, and dragged them toward the door. The first sheet of rain slapped the sidewalk so flat it seemed like a cruel magic trick. In seconds, the path filled with water until my careful curve was a shallow stream. I thought of the rose and whispered, "Hold on," like I could throw a rope across the distance with my mouth. A branch snapped in a different part of the day. Thunder arrived not as sound but as a shove. Then the wind came in earnest. It ran its hands through the basil and broke it. It threw the marigolds to their faces as if shaming them for their brightness. It leaned the lavender all in one direction, a choir left mid-bough. Dandelions, so bold in their impolite persistence, shed white flags that turned into wet confetti. The rose, Magda's rose, bent, then bent more, then seemed to make a decision I could not hear. I was soaked in seconds, hair plastered to my neck, the taste of metal at the back of my throat as if the sky had put pennies on my tongue. Inside, I ordered myself. Therapist voice, firm and out of patience with my heroics. I backed over the threshold, pulled the door, and watched through the glass as the storm took liberties. The basil flattened into a dark slick. The marigolds' heads came off in two bright pops that made no sound. The lavender twisted its ankle. The rose thrashed against the meanness of the gusts until one cane split, a neat, cruel mouth. I stood with my palms on the door as if I could keep the whole day from running away. Water found every seam in the yard I hadn't known existed. The path became a river again. The bench, even brought in, leaned in solidarity with what was happening out there. I knew, somewhere beyond panic, that the storm would pass. That's the kind thing about weather. It doesn't negotiate. It just leaves when it's ready. But knowing didn't help as much as it should have. I pressed my forehead to the cool glass and felt the hollow thud of loss begin in my ribs. I had made something here. Not a masterpiece, not a catalog-ready spread, but a haven. The kind you recognize with your feet before your brain catches up. To see it tossed, scolded, slapped around by sky felt like a violation that exceeded the facts. I wasn't just losing flowers. I was watching the quiet we'd managed to gather be scattered like bargain bin confetti. I watched basil leaves stick to the brick like medicinal poultices for a hurt too large to treat. The storm lasted 40 minutes and 15 years. When it finally staggered off, rain thinning to a manageable pour, thunder mumbling its way toward another county, the garden looked like it had been left by a careless guest. Mud streaked the marigold's ruffles. The lavender lay as if the whole world slanted and it was simply acknowledging reality. The rose's split cane hung like a sentence someone had started and couldn't finish. And the basil was a mosaic of bright torn green, already browning at torn edges, smelling like an Italian grandmother had clapped too hard. I stepped into the afterweather, shoes sinking in the soup of my soil, and did what I tell people not to do with shock. I catalogued. This broke. That snapped. This held. That puddled. The list kept me from crying, which felt like both a mercy and a betrayal. My hand found the rose's rupture and held it like a throat. "I'm sorry," I said, ridiculous and sincere. As I worked my way around, uprighting what could be righted with simply 2 hands and a little faith, the sky pulled its best guilty culprit trick and cleared. The sun shrugged and pretended it had never been complicit. Water made everything shine, which would have been beautiful if it hadn't been grief wearing glitter. Neighbors cracked doors and peered out. Somewhere a child who'd been forbidden the storm squealed. "It's over," like a blessing. I staked what I could. Skewers from the kitchen, twine from the drawer where I keep things that might one day be useful. I hobbled the lavender 2 stems at a time, whispering apologies when my knot found leaf instead of air. I coaxed the marigolds back to their feet and wiped their faces with my thumb like a mother who can't help fussing. I took scissors to the rose's split cane and cut clean, because an honest wound is kinder than a ragged one. Each snip made a sound I felt in my mouth. By the time the light began its slide toward evening, I had done what I could and knew I had not done enough. The garden looked upright the way a person looks upright after crying. Correct, technically, but looser at the joints. Mud had written its version of the day on every leaf. The path held a little lake that would not surrender. I went inside not because I wanted to, but because my body insisted. My knees had begun to talk about ice packs like a Teamsters union. I showered the storm off and watched the water in the tub turn the color of tea. I made toast I didn't eat. I sat on the floor with my back against the couch and, for the first time since the wind hit, let myself feel it. I cried in the quiet way. No flailing, no gulping, just water letting itself out. I cried for the basil I'd been counting on for a dinner that would taste like July, and for the marigolds whose ridiculous audacity had gotten me through conversations that otherwise would have ended in polite despair, and for the lavender that had taught me where to put my nose when the world got big. I cried for the rose because it stood for Magda and also for the part of me that only just remembered what blooming felt like. Mostly, I cried because the place we had made, the one where people came to be held without being handled, had been handled by the sky. I went to bed early and thudded into sleep like a dropped book. The wind had exhausted even its ghosts. The night settled into the kind of still you can only hear when you've been swirled. In the morning, the first sensation was dread. A heavy, low-hung curtain drawn across the mind. Then, underneath it, an odd little spark that felt like hope disguised as denial. I went to the window, bracing for the kind of inventory that would make coffee feel like a poor instrument. What I saw instead made my heart do a thing I would later in my notes call recalibration. There were people in my yard. I stood there in sleep shorts and a t-shirt with a paint stain on the hem, hair doing an impression of a dandelion in late May, and watched a quiet brigade of the familiar. Peter, tie tucked into his shirt like he was in a wind tunnel that had already passed, knelt by the rows with a proper stake and a coil of soft green garden tape he must have had in a garage cabinet labeled "Things We Hope We Never Need." The teacher, skirt swapped for shorts, legs bare and brave, was already elbow-deep in mud, coaxing the lavender to stand as if she were coaching a classroom of exhausted third graders through the last 5 minutes before recess. Lyra, in an oversized hoodie that declared an allegiance to a band I'd never heard of, crouched by the marigolds with a paintbrush of all things, delicately brushing mud from each petal like an archivist saving gold leaf on a medieval text. Mr. Ruiz, the mail carrier, had his satchel slung crosswise and was laying down small trenches with the heel of his boot to drain the puddle that had swallowed my path. Every so often he would step back and squint like a civil engineer accepting applause from the earth. Emma was there too, hair in a bun that made less of a point than it usually did, holding 2 steaming paper cups and a roll of twine. She looked up and caught me at the window, lifted both cups like an offering, then jerked her head toward the door in a polite demand. I opened it, and the smell of morning after ruin came in. Wet soil, sun on damp brick, the faint metallic apology of last night's thunder. "You started without me," I said, without meaning it as an accusation. "We were on time," Emma said, handing me a cup. "You're late." She smiled with the sort of mischief that knows when it's allowed. "How did you all—" "Word spreads quietly," the teacher said from her squat. "Isn't that your whole thing?" Mr. Ruiz, heel shaping another small river, shrugged. "Saw the mess on my route last night," he said. "Texted a few people, also left notes in the boxes. Wildflower seed packets have a backside for a reason." Lyra lifted the paintbrush to show me the mud it had collected. "I brought the only tool I own," she said, "other than pencils." Peter didn't look up. He was humming something old and careful. His fingers moved with the tenderness of a person tying a tie for a child on the first day of school. "Roses know storms," he said, "but it helps to be told they aren't alone afterward." I stepped into the yard barefoot because it felt necessary to feel what the garden felt. The mud squelched between my toes and made me grin against my will. Emma pressed twine into my palm. "We're staking," she said. "We're rewriting. We're saying not today, but in plant." I knelt by the basil and winced. It looked like someone had stepped on a choir. "We can salvage a lot," the teacher said, reading the wince. "We'll pinch what's gone to trauma and let the rest say yes again." "I brought eggshells," Mr. Ruiz announced, as if he were pulling confetti from a hat. "Crushed. My mother swore by them after storms. We can frame it as cultural wisdom, not superstition, if you need that." "We don't," I said. I didn't. For the next 2 hours we worked without speeches. It felt like a barn raising. Only instead of wood and nails, we had twine, hands, and a collective agreement that what the storm took we would coax back to itself. The teacher's practical competence rearranged chaos. Peter's gentleness made the rose stand taller than I'd thought possible with such fresh grief on its cane. Lyra's brush turned the marigolds' faces from crime scenes back into comedians. Emma set a rhythm, cut, tie, stake, water, that made time feel useful without being a thief. Mr. Ruiz dug channels that lured the water away with the shy cunning of a fox. Other neighbors wandered in and found tasks waiting for them as if the garden had made a list overnight. The HOA president, in his Saturday polo and shoes that had never met mud, brought a bundle of bamboo stakes he'd ordered once and never used. He handed them to me with a look that contained both apology and initiation. A boy from 2 doors down carried out his own plastic sand shovel and went to work with the gravity of a surgeon. Someone's grandmother left a jar of sugar water for the hummingbirds, and a story about how storms used to be named for the saints they interrupted. We staked and spoked and pressed and mended. The basil gave in both directions. We pinched what could be saved and gathered what couldn't into a bowl, which Emma took inside and turned into a ridiculous amount of pesto that showed up later with crackers and a generosity that felt like another kind of staked stem. The lavender's lean evened out under the exoskeleton of bamboo and string, and when I cupped a bloom and inhaled, it answered back with a new version of itself, rain-washed, resolute, a little wilder. The marigolds shook off their indignities and then, because they are who they are, showed off. Magda's rose, our rose, stood upright by late morning, taped and braced, the wound clean, the remaining buds unrepentant. Peter touched the stake the way a person touches a newel post at the bottom of stairs, testing for sturdiness and intimacy. He gathered the fallen petals in his palm and lifted them to his nose with a look I will spend years finding words for. When we paused, it was because the sun said we had to. We sat on the steps and the bench and the bricks, sprinkling ourselves with hose mist like humidifiers that had wandered off their basements. Someone had brought muffins of the blueberry persuasion. Someone else passed around strawberries that tasted like the color they were. The bowl of basil became a project in generosity, smeared on whatever vehicle showed up. Crackers, toast, a spoon. I looked at these people, the ones who had arrived in my life through grief anxiety, deadheading advice, mail routes, and drawings, and felt the tight private thing I had been guarding begin to loosen its grip. The garden had been, at first, a room I made for my own breathing, then a porch where I invited one person at a time to step out of weather together. And now it was a commons. Not mine, not theirs, ours. It had a pulse independent of my hands. It was, I realized, not merely a sanctuary I was creating. It was a practice we were making together. I put the paper cup down and wiped a streak of mud from Emma's forearm with the automatic gentleness of someone who has learned that the smallest care counts. She grinned. "You okay?" she asked. I was not, I said honestly. Now I am something like okay plus. Storms recalibrate, the teacher said, pulling her hair into a ponytail with the last workable elastic produced from a pocket as if by sorcery. Kids come in after a fire drill charged with panic. Then they sit on the rug and take turns naming their favorite sandwich, and the molecules in the room arrange themselves into cooperative. Lyra passed me the paintbrush like a baton. "I'll come back later and draw the new version," she said, "with the crutches and the heroic scars." Mr. Ruiz, satisfied with his drainage, nodded at the path. "We might need to lay some gravel at the low spots," he said. "I know a guy. He owes me the kind of favor that comes with a wheelbarrow." Peter set a petal on his palm and held it out. "For Magda," he said softly. "A storm was an excuse to make soup and call it supper. This seems like the garden's version." I laughed, and didn't feel the laugh apologize for itself. We went back to our tasks with the gentle greed of people who have discovered a reason to stay outside. By noon, the yard looked less like a crime scene and more like a hospital after a night shift. Bandaged, exhausted, undeniably alive. New mud fingerprints were everywhere, on leaves, on arms, on cheeks, on the mailbox. If the HOA wanted to write a letter, I hoped they'd use pencil. When the last stake was tied and the final puddle convinced to relocate, we stood in an accidental semicircle and admired what we had done as if we'd planted a flag on a small green moon. No one took a picture. It didn't feel like a moment that wanted proof. It felt like one that wanted to live in the body. After everyone drifted back into their day, some to showers, some to naps, some to the kind of quiet you take in small pockets and call it blessed, I stayed outside and hosed the mud off my feet. The water ran brown, then clearer, then ordinary. I knelt by the basil stumps and thanked them for their service. I touched the lavender and felt where it had leaned and where it had been persuaded kindly to stand. I put my cheek near the marigolds and let them tell me a joke. I sat on the step and looked at the garden the way you look at a person you love after you've seen them cry. The storm had been a theft. The storm had been a gift. It had shown me the borders of what I thought I owned and invited me to redraw them with softer lines. What began as my escape has turned, in a span of one wild night and one determined morning, into a shared act of quiet healing. The garden is not mine. It is ours in the way a song belongs to the room that sings it. I picked up my notebook and wrote, dirt falling in the margin like confetti. A haven is not a place without storms. It is a place where, after the storm, people show up with their hands. A breeze moved through, the gentle kind, the kind that leaves nothing worse than goosebumps in its wake. The rose shifted and held. The basil, ridiculous with bravery, already sent up a brave little green like a hand raised in class. The lavender breathed. I breathed back. When sunset finally arrived, later than any of us expected, the light fell across the garden like a benediction that didn't require anyone to close their eyes. The storm had flattened part of our small world. We had stood it up. We had said together, not today. We had found that what we were making here could survive. Not because of my plan, but because of our hands. And for the first time since I knelt for a dandelion and felt the world go quiet, I understood. I am not the keeper of this place. I am one of the kept. ChatGPT said, by late summer, the garden had become something I couldn't have designed even if I'd tried, which is to say it had become exactly what it needed to be. The edges I'd once kept neat had grown soft, overrun not with neglect but with generosity. Roses bloomed alongside lavender, their scents trading places with the wind. A stand of sunflowers, planted by a boy from down the street who had never said more than 5 words to me, leaned against the fence, their round faces too heavy for their stems, as if drunk on August. Basil kept coming back even after the storm's tantrum. The marigolds multiplied beyond anything sensible, clustering like cousins who can't stop telling the same story. And near the path, where the grass met soil, someone had left a small wooden sign, hand-painted in careful, uneven letters. The Comfort Garden. No one confessed to making it. When I asked, people just smiled the way you smile when you've kept a good secret. I stopped thinking of the garden as mine somewhere around the time I started holding what I called garden hours instead of traditional sessions. It wasn't therapy in the way my license had been trained to define therapy. Some afternoons we worked in companionable silence, our hands in dirt, our breath sinking to the rhythm of a watering can's pour. Other times people talked, haltingly, easily, sideways through stories about seedlings and pruning that were never really about seedlings or pruning. Both were enough. Peter tended Magda's rose like a daily prayer, sometimes speaking to it in Polish, sometimes just sitting nearby with his coffee, letting the rose keep him company. The teacher weeded with the brisk efficiency of someone who has 15 minutes before the bell rings, talking about her students in the same tone she used for the lavender, gentle, a little amused, always invested. Lyra came with a sketchbook under her arm and left with hands smudged in both graphite and soil. I'd thought holding space was something I could only do in an office, inside the walls where my degrees hung and the clock ticked. But out here, time had a different language. There was no ticking, only the slow arc of the sun across the beds, the way light shifted from silver morning to gold evening. Conversations didn't end because the hour was over. They ended because the work paused, or the watering was done, or the body knew it had had enough for one day. And something in me, something I hadn't realized had been clenched, loosened. I wasn't exhausted anymore, not in the way I had been when my days were back-to-back appointments and my evenings were spent staring at the ceiling in a quiet that felt more like absence than peace. This work didn't drain me. It rooted me. My voice came home with me instead of staying behind in the office. My mind didn't replay sessions at night. I'd given everything that needed giving while my hands were already busy, planting or tying up a leaning stem. And the people I worked with seemed to leave lighter, not because I had fixed anything, but because we'd made something together in the meantime. My home changed too. It used to be silent in a way that was almost staged, like it was waiting for a photograph. Now it hummed, not with noise exactly, but with presence. The scent of lavender drifted through the open window. Basil leaves rested in a bowl on the counter, left by someone who'd brought too much home from their own patch. My front porch held a collection of things I hadn't placed there. A basket of cherry tomatoes, a jar of marigold seeds, a folded paper with a poem about rain written in a looping hand. People came and went without ceremony. Sometimes they waved as they passed. Sometimes they came in, knelt by the roses, and left without saying a word. No one asked for permission anymore. The garden had stopped belonging to me in the best possible way. It belonged to whoever needed it at that moment. Late one afternoon, I was tying the sunflowers to bamboo stakes when Emma walked up with 2 mugs of iced tea. She handed me one and said, "Do you realize you've created something that works even when you're not in it?" I looked around. Peter was crouched near the lavender, tucking mulch around its base. Lyra sat cross-legged in the grass, sketching the teacher, who was showing a neighbor's child how to pull weeds without taking out the flowers by mistake. The air was full of low, contented sounds, the scratch of a pencil, the rustle of leaves, the faint trickle from the hose someone had forgotten to turn off. I smiled. "I think it's created itself." She raised her glass. "To shared roots," she said. I clinked mine against hers. That night, as the sun slipped behind the houses and painted the garden in warm, syrupy light, I sat on the bench with dirt-streaked hands, the smell of basil still clinging to my skin. Around me, people moved quietly, watering, tying, clipping, brushing soil from petals. No one was in a hurry. No one seemed to be anywhere but here. The comfort garden had bloomed into something far larger than I'd ever intended. It wasn't just a collection of flowers. It was a stitched-together quilt of everyone who touched it. Each plant a story, each path a conversation, each bloom a reminder that we'd all knelt in the same soil at some point and stood up feeling better for it. The air grew cooler. Fireflies began to blink at the edges of the yard. A few people lingered. Others drifted toward the sidewalk, carrying the calm with them. I stayed where I was, letting the sounds of watering cans, quiet laughter, and rustling leaves fill the space where loneliness used to live. This was my work now. Not just holding space for people, but tending to it alongside them, letting things grow, letting myself grow. And as the last of the sun slid away, I realized I'd never felt more at home, both in my house and in my own skin. And that ends tonight's meditation. You're welcome to stay for a bit longer if you like. Have a beautiful night. Until next time.